This time on combat ships. The story of one of the world's most effective war machines, the Viking Longship.
The key to their achievements was the ships. Warships which allowed them to raid, cargo ships that allowed them to trade.
They evolved from swift war canoes to become the preeminent fighting machines of the age.
Today, if we think of what's at the forefront of technology, we think, well, spacecraft and airliners and nuclear submarines and so on. But go back 800 years, it's the boat.
They were elegant, versatile, and feared.
You knew that when you saw a fleet of 5, 10, 15 ships coming around the headland and that they were sailing directly for your little coastal settlement, I think you would pack your bags and head for the hills as quickly as you could.
Longships carried terrifying warriors.
They will have weapons, they will bang their swords against the shields, they will be horrible people to meet, and they will approach fast.
The Vikings and their ships changed the course of history. Combat ships. Fast. Effective.
The mission is pure James Bond espionage.
Deadly.
Japan is willing to throw the dice to engage just about every aspect of their military force in a climactic, decisive battle to stop the United States.
They have changed the world.
Warships have been key factors in global history, from the beginning of civilization to the present day.
Thanks to clever design, raw firepower, and the heroism of their crews. In the year 793, the people of Northumberland, in the north of England, knew something terrible was about to happen. Storms and whirlwinds filled the sky. There were rumors of dragons on the wing. Then what they feared came to pass. From across the ocean, a force of mighty warriors appeared in large warships. Their target was the wealthy monastery on the holy island of Lindisfarne. The invaders captured or drowned Lindisfarne's monks, stole their treasure, and desecrated their sanctuary. The attackers were described as heathens from a pagan race. They were the infamous, fearsome Vikings.
The attack on Lindisfarne really shocked the Anglo-Saxons, and it's described very much as God's judgment on the English for their ungodly ways. It's a really dramatic beginning to what's known now as the Viking Age.
The English historian Alfred wrote soon after the attack,
"Never before has such terror appeared in Britain, nor was it thought that such an inroad from the sea could be made."
So, who were the Vikings? These warriors whose name over 1,000 years later is still synonymous with violence, bloodshed, and the sea.
Viking actually meant, in Old Norse, pirate, raider, marauder. So it's more of a job description, but it's an easier label than trying to give any sort of ethnic status to these people.
The Vikings came from Scandinavia, the three territories that we know today as Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. It was the landscape of that region that shaped their culture. Denmark and Sweden are made up of islands and had dense, inaccessible forests.
Norway literally means the northern way, the northern sailing route, and it's one long coastline punctuated by fjords, while the land itself is broken up by mountains, so it's much easier to get around by boat than by land.
Forced into ships, they were quick to realize the possibilities.
I think they were very astute people, that they could see quite quickly, again through this maritime network that they had, that there was a much wider world out there. And I think it's probably one of the most important aspects of the Viking Age, that they were very much a people who looked outwards. They are exceptionally curious people and exceptionally brave in terms of where they want to go with their ships and why.
The Vikings had dreams of exploration and conquest. They needed a vessel to match: the longship. Remarkably, some still survive. This is a so-called Osberg ship, uncovered from a burial mound south of Oslo in Norway in 1904. It's now in the capital's Viking Ship Museum. It is the oldest Norwegian Viking ship. 95% of its original timbers survive.
This Viking ship was preserved like a tinned Viking ship, really. No one had seen anything like it. It was even so well preserved that one day the archaeologist found a bucket, like a huge bucket, and in the bucket there were apples, and they were still red. That's amazing.
The features that made it such an effective combat ship are also intact. Most important is its shape. The longship, a catch-all term for all large Viking vessels, has a shallow draft, meaning that very little of the hull was below the waterline. This helped them move swiftly and in shallow water, deep into enemy territory.
In the beginning of the Viking era, it's really the speed at which they were able to attack, that their ships just gave them a mobility that was unheard of, essentially, that they can just round a headland in a fleet of ships and sail right up onto the beach.
They can also go right up rivers and sail deep inland. That meant that they could attack targets inland in Britain and Ireland. In France, they sailed all the way up to Paris, up the Seine. In Russia, again, they're penetrating deep into the river systems.
Soon they ventured even further, to the Mediterranean and the Middle East, and west across the North Atlantic. Their raiding ships had to withstand longer voyages and combat at sea. From the 8th century, they were equipped with a large sail, which was supported by a massive block of timber called a keelson. It spread the weight of the mast and the strain of the sail when underway. When there was no wind, the crew would place oars through holes in the upper strakes, or planks. Parts of the decking were kept loose, so weapons and plunder could be stored underneath. The Viking Museum in Oslo has a second fine example of a Viking shipwright's skill, excavated from another burial mound. This is the Gokstad ship.
The Gokstad ship is probably fairly typical of the Viking ships of the late 9th century. It's beautifully designed. It's got enough carrying capacity that it can carry supplies, it can carry loot. It's got oars for rowing when the wind's against you, a single square sail when the wind's with you. So it's versatile in the way it could be used.
And it was designed to strike terror upon arrival.
I think it probably would have been an incredibly awe-inspiring and terrifying sight, that we know from the historical depictions that these ships were highly decorated, quite a few of them would have been painted, and I think it probably would have just struck absolute terror into the hearts of people if you knew that when you saw a fleet of 5, 10, 15 ships coming around the headland and you knew that they were full of warriors and that they were sailing directly for your little coastal settlement. I think you would pack your bags and head for the hills as quickly as you could.
An 11th century account said,
Such was the decoration of the ships, that to those who were looking from afar, they seemed to be made more of flame than of wood. Here shone the gleam of weapons, here the flame of hanging shields. The ships alone would have terrified the enemy, even before the warriors could move to join battle.
The Vikings carried with them their most valuable possession, prized more than family, a weapon that brought death and destruction. The Viking ships helped make them the dominant force in Europe for over 200 years. Their shallow draft shape was perfect for storming beaches. Their construction made them strong and versatile assault vessels. The Osberg and Gokstad ships, now in a museum in Oslo, like all Viking longships, were clinker-built. That means constructed using overlapping planks or strakes. It was a highly successful technique. The Vikings laid the keel first. It was often made of a single piece of wood. They built up overlapping planks on either side of the keel, then secured them with iron nails. The shipwrights fastened floor timbers across the lower planks to support the shape of the hull. They then placed the keelson, which holds the mast in position. Cross beams known as bights lock the sides together. The Vikings cut oar holes into the upper planks. The mast and deck were fitted. They then added a steering oar to the right-hand side of the stern. The word starboard derives from this steering board. In a workshop in the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde in Denmark, a team of shipwrights still make clinker-built ships using traditional tools and techniques. They use the wood favored by their Viking ancestors, oak.
It has the quality that it's strong, but it's also durable against rot, so it lasts for a long time. It has acid in it, which is resistant towards fungus and rot. So it's both strong and durable.
The Vikings didn't use saws for boat building. They cleaved, that is, split the trunks to keep the natural strength of the wood. It's possible to obtain 25 planks from this single 200-year-old tree.
You start out with small wedges, and then you slowly change into bigger wedges. You can see that the moist of the wood is actually coming out, so there's already quite a lot of pressure on. This tree is 200 years plus 210 years approximately. And it's really wide pieces of planking we get out here. It's nearly 1.5 feet, something like that. So it's a really big piece of oak. The plan with this oak is to split it into quarters, eighths, and sixteenths. So in the end, you come out with approximately this much piece of material, and then you start chopping it down with your axe from there.
Then, as now, the Vikings knew their way around an axe.
So I'm just shaping off, so it's the fine-tuning.
The Viking shipbuilders wasted nothing.
They would use really every part of the tree where the branches were bending. They would use exactly those bends where they needed this shape in the ship.
Working closely with the Viking shipwright on the construction of a longship would be the blacksmith. He was an integral part of Viking society, in peace and war.
You need the blacksmith to make the nails, to make the tools, so they were not going to war. It will be home and make the tools, so other people can go to war. There will be no Viking ship without the blacksmith.
The planks that made up the hulls of their combat ships were fixed together with thousands of nails. As the hull would take considerable punishment from both the sea and the enemy, it was vital they were the right size.
If the nails are too big, it will break the wood, and if it's too small, there will come water inside.
This process is unchanged in 1,000 years.
So I break it. And heat it again. I put the nail in linseed oil It will make a kind of coating, so it not rust so easy. I put it in the water, just for cooling down.
In the Viking Museum in Oslo is another example of the blacksmith's art, a weapon that was a key part of the equipment on any longship.
It's a very typical Viking sword, so I think that when this was new, it will be a very beautiful sword. And for a Viking, a sword was more than a weapon. It was also a piece of jewelry, the most valuable possession that you had. It was something that made you a man. And if you're rich, you will have several weapons. And it was actually forbidden for a free man not to have any weapon. It's a society where the strongest one wins. I would say it's very terrifying to live like that. You will live in fear. The sword is beautiful, it's fascinating, it's really a symbol of the Viking period, but it is also a symbol of a period based on violence.
A Viking warrior was rarely separated from his weapon, even at sea.
You wouldn't leave your sword. You will have it as close at hand as possible. However, when you were working on a ship as a crew member, you might need to put it away because it's big and it's a bit clumsy. So perhaps you will have it in your chest. You had a chest with some belongings, and you were also sitting on that chest when you were rowing. I can see this man, and he loved this thing, perhaps even as high as his family members. It was a part of him, and he loved it, and he carried it with him all the time. And now I'm touching this. It gives us a link between me and this unknown man.
An Old Norse saga reveals just how important weapons were to the Vikings. It tells the story of a warrior's wife who steals his sword, nicknamed Footbiter, and leaves their baby in its place. Furious, the warrior chooses his weapon over his child and says,
"Take your daughter. I would give a great deal of money before I should care to let my sword go."
Vikings valued their weapons and their ships so highly, they never wanted to be separated from them, even in death. For the Vikings, their ships were a means of transport both in life and in death.
I think we can be pretty confident that ships had a major symbolic meaning for the Vikings. People are quite literally using a ship as a means of burial to take them into the next life.
Some were buried surrounded by stones in the shape of a ship. The more elite Vikings were placed on a vessel, which was then covered with earth. The Osberg ship was a ship burial with two surprising bodies on board.
Now, what's remarkable about Oseberg in particular is that it's not, as you might expect, the grave of a warrior king or great male war leader, but the two skeletons buried within it were both women. It's very likely to be the grave of a queen and perhaps her handmaid sacrificed alongside her in the way that we sometimes associate with male burials of the period.
They were buried in this ship with a lot of belongings and a lot of animals that were offered to follow the two ladies in their grave on the journey to the afterlife.
Ships were more than just wood and nails.
They were the soul of the Vikings, I will say. Viking without a boat is not a Viking. I think that it was impossible for the Vikings to separate the real life and the practical use of a ship and their dreams and the mythology and the way of living. So a teenager in the Viking period would dream about a wonderful ship and a voyage, just like a teenager today would dream of a nice car.
Their ships were given nicknames like Orsteed, Surf Dragon, and Great Serpent. Where did this tradition come from? It turns out the Vikings were not the first Scandinavians to go raiding at sea. A museum in Denmark has proof that 1,000 years before the Vikings, ships played a major role in the lives of Bronze and Iron Age Scandinavians, often at war with each other. These carvings show a community ritual with a vessel being pulled off the shore into the sea. Further evidence of the importance of ships in the Bronze Age are these tiny gold boats found buried in a grave in Denmark. The bows of ships even decorated the helmets of Bronze Age warriors. They may not have been called Vikings, but these warriors were formidable sea raiders, and they had a combat ship of their own, an ancestor of the longship. This vessel is almost 2,500 years old and was found in a peat bog near Hjortspring in Denmark in 1921. This was no shipwreck. The Hjortspring boat was captured by a Danish tribe, who then filled it with the vanquished enemy's weapons and shields, then deliberately sank it as an offering to the gods.
This boat is designed as a swift war canoe, or we could actually call it an efficient landing craft. It could swift go in on the shore, and since this boat is symmetrical, it can actually leave the coast very quickly.
The boat was clinker built out of overlapping planks, like the longship, and sewn together with plant fiber.
There's no metal parts in the boat. They are just sewn together with 1,500 small holes. But still a little bit water could penetrate alongside these plant fibers in the hole. But that was no problem, because in each hole around the plant fiber, we could see that some sort of organic fat material has been used to make the boat watertight. But of course, during paddling, during sailing, you always have to put more of this animal fat in the holes.
This organic construction gave this boat an ability to bend, but not break when moving through rough water. It maintained its overall shape and strength thanks to 10 frames fixed across the width of the boat. Each frame provided a seat for 2 men propelling the ship with wooden paddles.
It's quite interesting to see that the paddles, as they were found together with the ship, that they have a little bit different size. So one could actually say that the paddles were tailored for each man of the crew.
The men were a well-armed invading army. Found with the boat were shields with a raised center to protect the warrior's hand as he went into battle. Spearheads and arrows, some bent by impact, others worn down by sharpening. These warriors and their fast ships would have been a formidable invasion force.
If you are in a fleet of, should we say, 4 or 6 of those boats with up to 100 men or more, you could make a surprise attack by moving 100 kilometers per day.
The captured Hjortspring canoe is evidence of the bitter warfare between the ancient peoples of Denmark. 1,000 years later, their Viking descendants were still threatened by their neighbors, and they had an effective and ingenious method of deterring attackers. The Vikings used their impressive longships to fight enemies overseas and each other. This is the Roskilde Fjord in Denmark. By the year 1000, the nearby town of Roskilde was the capital of the Danish kings. but it was vulnerable to raids from the fjord by hostile Norwegian fleets and rival claimants to the Danish throne.
To protect the town from attack from the sea, they took 5 worn-out ships and essentially towed them out onto the fjord and then intentionally scuttled them, so they were sunk intentionally to block one of the sailing channels to create a barrier to stop attack from the sea.
In the 1960s, the ships that formed the blockade were recovered and placed in a museum.
We can see from the way that they were deposited that 3 of the ships were deposited first, and then as they kind of fell apart, a further 2 were deposited on top of them.
The ships found in the fjord were a mixture of types, warships, but also cargo vessels. These were essential for any fleet intent on plunder or invasion.
So they would more than likely have been sailing in a combined fleet where you would have had these long, narrow warships and then also the ocean-going merchant ships where you have much more room for supplies and equipment.
The Vikings called these cargo ships nars. The museum at Roskilde took the dimensions of a nar sunk in the fjord and made a full-size replica, christened Ottar.
It's got a completely different shape to the warship. It's much sturdier, much broader across the beam, so you can essentially fill it up with a lot more cargo than you could with a longship, and it requires a much smaller crew to sail it too, so a much better alternative for a trader or a merchant.
The Viking cargo ships carried a variety of goods to trade or to supply an army.
It could be either anything from pottery to grain to sheep and cattle. It has been all kinds of different cargo, anything from barrels of beer and meat to salted pickled herring, and you name it, they probably carried it.
Ottar was built using authentic materials. The hull is made of oak, secured with iron nails, and the ropes in the rigging are made of hemp and horsehair.
You could compare it to driving a very old vintage truck. It's nice, it's not fast. Everything is a little more primitive. Of course, all the materials are natural fibers and wood, so you need to know a little more of how to handle everything on the boat. On the other hand, if you compare this ship, which is from around 1030, with a sailing cargo ship from the 1850s, for example, we handled quite similar. So, of a time span of almost 800 years, cargo sailing didn't really change much. What we found out, apart from boat handling, there's also that it's a very seaworthy ship. We can cross oceans with this one. We've been across the North Sea, so we've been to Scotland and Norway, Germany, Poland, Sweden. I have no doubt that they have been doing the same back then with the same type of ship.
They were incredible skilled people. They knew how to live in their environment. So when you started on a voyage, you would know that the next point will be this landmark, and they felt the nature, the wind, the waves, and they learned these things by heart.
The existence of cargo ships is evidence of a change in Viking strategy that occurred in the 9th century, about 70 years after the raid on Lindisfarne. The Vikings wanted a more permanent foothold on the countries they plundered. They wanted colonies, which the cargo ships supplied. Principal among these territories was the rich and fertile land of Britain. In 865, an intimidating force of Vikings landed on the east coast of England. An ancient Anglo-Saxon chronicle said,
"And the same year came a large heathen army into England, and fixed their winter quarters in East Anglia, where they were soon horsed, and the inhabitants made peace with them."
The Vikings weren't peaceful for long. They swept through the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Northumbria and Mercia. The kingdom of Wessex, named after the West Saxons, stood defiant. Its king was one of the most famous in British history, Alfred the Great.
What makes Alfred stand out are two things. His success as a military leader, but he's also a cultural figure. So he's a learned man who appreciates the value of education. And in that respect, he's way ahead of most kings of his time.
In 897, Viking ships from East Anglia and Northumbria attacked the Saxons all along the south coast of Wessex. Alfred needed to do something drastic to stop them. He decided to build his own fleet of warships to take on the invaders. That decision would earn him the nickname, the Father of the English Navy. So what did Alfred's Anglo-Saxon combat ships look like? Clues lie in this 7th century burial mound at Sutton Hoo, in the east of England. It was built for the remains of an Anglo-Saxon leader, 200 years before Alfred. When archaeologists excavated the mound in 1939, they found the remains of a large clinker-built vessel. Gareth Williams is an expert on the Sutton Hoo find.
The ship that was buried in the mound survived really only as an impression in the soil. The individual rivets survived, and then the marks where the planks had been. So the wood itself is lost.
This metal sculpture near the burial site shows the size of the Sutton Hoo ship.
A vessel like this would have been primarily a troop transporter. The crew that rowed it would also have been warriors on land. And the chieftain or king who was buried there would have been their captain, both on the boat, almost certainly, and in war.
The Sutton Hoo vessel shows the Saxons knew how to make combat ships. But to stop the Vikings, they'd have to make them bigger. An Anglo-Saxon historian wrote,
Then King Alfred gave orders for building longships against the Danish vessels, which were full nigh twice as long as the others. Some had 60 oars, some more, and they were both swifter and steadier, and also higher than the others.
The ships were probably constructed from oak trees in the Wessex forests. Once they were completed, Alfred took the fight to the Vikings. In the 9th century, naval strategy was almost non-existent. Battles at sea were more like battles on land.
They will start the battle with throwing missiles, throwing stones, and then they will be closer and closer, and so close that they could jump into the ship of the enemy.
Height gave an advantage for things like archery, use of spears and stones and other missiles, and it also meant that striking down with swords and axes, you've got that advantage. So the taller ships would offer an advantage there.
It worked. Alfred's navy won victories against the Viking foe. And in the last years of his reign, there were no major Viking attacks. For the first time, an English ruler had recognized that a permanent fleet was necessary for the defense of the realm. That permanent fleet still exists, although over the years the ships have looked very different. King Alfred's Saxon descendants continued to use longships to great effect, taking the fight to the Vikings.
His grandson, Athelstan, who was the first ruler of the whole of England, building on the success of his father and grandfather, raided as far as Scotland with a fleet, sailing up the east coast and projecting that military power right round the British Isles. He even called himself King of all Britain, Rex Totius Britanniae.
Just over 100 years after Athelstan, an English king faced a new longship threat, not from Scandinavia, but much closer to home. This invasion fleet would change history forever. By the 11th century, the Viking longship had been the most feared combat ship in Europe for over 200 years. King Alfred of Wessex had been one of the few kings who had successfully halted the Viking advance. 180 years after his death, another fleet of enemy longships appeared off the south coast of England. The fleet was larger than anything Alfred could have imagined. Once more, longships would change the course of history. The year was 1066. It was a Norman invasion fleet, sailing from France under the command of Duke William of Normandy. His ships would have been familiar to any Viking, with good reason.
The word Norman is just another variant on Norseman or Northman. They were Vikings who came from Scandinavia in the late 9th century, and rather than attacking northwestern France, they started to settle in an area of northwestern France that by the early 10th century was known as Normannia or Normandy, the land of the Norsemen.
William of Normandy believed he had a claim to the English throne. Standing in his way was Harold Godwinson, who had been crowned king in London on the 6th of January, 1066.
He's going to have to depose Harold, and that means this astonishingly reckless undertaking, which is to invade England, to assemble an armada, and pull off the kind of feat that they know hasn't been achieved since the time of Julius Caesar 1,000 years before. The problem for the Normans is that although they started off as Vikings and were masters of the sea, in the meantime they've acclimatized and gone native, and now they're all about castles, cavalry, crossbows, not so much about ships. The difficulty is they have to get across the channel, and for that they need old school Scandinavian Viking know-how.
William had to put a force together very quickly before Harold could consolidate his power. A record of the Norman invasion commissioned by William's family, known as the Bayeux Tapestry, depicts the Norman shipwrights chopping down trees and building boats from scratch.
If you look at the kind of ships that are depicted on the Bayeux Tapestry, they look exactly like the kind of ships that you have as a classical Viking Age ship, and also the kind of tools that are used in the boat building sequences at the beginning of the tapestry. They're the same kind of tools that you find in Viking Age excavation.
William's fleet included troop carriers for about 8,000 men. The tapestry shows his longships were loaded with horses. William's cavalry was key to his battle plan. This is the era of the mounted knight. The ships were custom fitted for the job.
Horses don't like to go across the sea. They must have led those horses onto specially constructed stalls on those boats to stop them from panicking. But I think however many they had, whether it was 1,000 or 2,000 horses, it gave them that critical edge in the conflict that followed.
William's fleet would have consisted of many ships like the sturdy Nar trading vessel found at Roskilde, specially designed for carrying cargo long distances. On the 28th of September, 1066, the Norman longships appeared on the horizon off the coast of Pevensey in Sussex in the south of England.
To anyone stood here on the beach at Pevensey, you imagine 700 sails, hostile sails, suddenly on the horizon. You are going to be running for the hills.
3 days after William landed here, Harold, who had been fighting another rival claimant to the throne 200 miles to the north, headed south to face him. They met at Hastings on the 14th of October, 1066. William's strategy was clear.
For William, it's critical that Harold dies that day. This is not a war of attrition, this is a decapitation strategy. Harold is king, William wishes to replace him. There's no room for negotiation there.
During the day-long battle, the longship's cargo of horses proved decisive.
It was undoubtedly worth the effort and the difficulty of trying to get those horses across the channel, because this is something that was very seldom done.
Harold is killed at Hastings, some believe by an arrow in the eye, paving the way for William to achieve something that none of his Viking ancestors could: the conquest of England. Yet 1066 marks the end of an era. William saw himself not as a Viking warrior, but as a Norman knight.
Generally, it's accepted that the Battle of Hastings and the Norman invasion marks the end of the Viking Age. It's here where they lose their political dominance and their political influence, and society kind of begins to evolve again into a feudal Anglo-Norman society.
The Viking era may have ended, but their superb combat shipbuilding skills were not lost. In the 9th century, the Vikings had settled in the Scottish islands of the Hebrides, Orkney, and Shetland. Over the years, as they assimilated with the native Scots, a new type of clinker-built boat emerged that would outlast the longship by 500 years. It would prove to be a small but effective combat ship. This is a replica of a Scottish vessel known as a Berlin. For 800 years, the Berlin was the predominant vessel in the west of Scotland. Any Viking would have recognized its design and construction. Clinker-built ships were ideal for the Scottish seas.
I think we have to say that clinker-built technology arrived with the Norse and was tremendously popular because the flexible, supple boats which it allowed to create were perfectly suited to the rough West Coast waters.
The hull is designed to move through the water very quickly, and with a good following wind and a well-managed sail, they are very fast and nimble boats. The basic principle is that when the wind was behind you, you could use the sail, but when the wind was against you, you really needed to use the oars, and the oars were very, very handy for manoeuvring the ship at close quarters and up rivers and onto beaches for beaching it.
Berlins tended to be smaller than longships, as the west of Scotland lacked the resources to make bigger boats.
We should always regard Berlins as being very homemade. In other words, you probably made everything you possibly could from locally resourced timbers and things like heather roots and things like that for ropes. So low-tech, effective, functional, cheap, did the job.
There was one key difference between the Viking longship and the Scottish vessels. By the 12th century, the Viking longship's steering oar had been replaced by a rudder fixed to the back of the ship. It made steering simpler and sharp turns much easier. Right up until the 17th century, the Berlin was the boat of choice for the chiefs of the Scottish network of families known as the clans, from the Gaelic word for children. Clans such as the MacDonalds and the McCrorys were often at war as they battled for regional supremacy.
The clan chief, as the Norwegian chiefs in the days in the sagas, was always keen to impress. A lot of this is about bling. It's about making sure people see your status. Look at the woodwork on my boat, look at the lines of my ship.
Viking and Anglo-Saxon naval tactics also lived on in the Berlins and their crews.
The commonest way they were used for combat was to get close to the ships of the opposition, lash the two vessels together, or more than two vessels together, and then get engaged in close hand-to-hand combat with swords and axes.
At the end of the day, though, if you've got a boat with 60 men aboard and you're tackling a boat with 20 men aboard, it's just a numbers game. If you can get alongside and get men overboard, that's it. Game up.
One of the reasons the Berlin survived so long was because it was a superb troop transporter. From the early 13th century onwards, when the Scottish clans weren't fighting each other, they were happy to take the money of Irish chiefs as mercenaries in their wars against each other or the English. Fleets of Berlins took the Scots across the ocean to Ireland. Their ships were far superior to anything the Irish possessed.
The Berlin essentially is their vehicle of choice. This is the articulated lorry. This is what takes them to where they need to be, and quickly, and gets them away if time gets tight.
It must have been an amazing sight to see 100 or more of these vessels, often quite big boats. Some of them could be 60 and 70 feet long with 100 men on board. So it would have been an extraordinary sight.
Although Berlins disappeared in the 17th century, this legacy of the Viking longship lives on into the 21st. Every year in Shetland in the north of Scotland, Islanders celebrate their Viking heritage and burn a ship. The burning vessel is a powerful reminder of the significance of one of the most influential combat ships of all. The longship is the iconic symbol of the Viking Age. It took warriors across the oceans to trade and raid. Longships helped bring about a victory that changed the face of history. The story of these vessels reveals a people who were often violent and bloody, but also expert craftsmen.
People ask me, what do you think is the most fascinating thing about the Vikings? And I think it was their willingness to take risks, to see what was on the other side. They were curious.
I think the biggest misunderstanding is that they were just these kind of mindless brutes who just hopped in their ships and sailed off and caused chaos. They were incredibly adaptable, and that they had an incredibly global perspective, that when you think about a time when most people probably never left their own village or travelled much more than 5 miles down the road, that kind of sense of adventure and that very open approach they had to life and to what they could get out of it, I think that's kind of an eternally fascinating theme.